you're here with Savage Fabrication once again to hear me ramble on for a little bit, but hopefully we can get some data across and kind of explain quite a few things. So in this episode, we're going to go over how we actually do see twin turbos used on turbo diesels. The last episode we left off saying we're going to show you how it's done, and in this episode we're going to show you how it's done. So real twin turbos, like we said, we're talking about earlier, real twins, basically they don't add double the density ratio at the same boost pressure, but what they do is they double the capacity of the system. So if we had one turbocharger that flowed 60 pounds a minute, and then we added a second turbo in parallel to that, so there were now two turbos the engine can draw through. Each turbo is rated for 60 pounds a minute. The whole system now can draw through 120 pounds a minute. In order to achieve 120 pounds a minute, you either have to increase the size of the engine, rev the engine to a much higher engine RPM, or increase the boost pressure at the same lower RPM to get there, given all this is based off of a lower displacement engine that was initially drawing 60 pounds a minute. If we added a second one and went back to the exact same scenario, we're still going to draw through 60 pounds a minute. The boost pressure is the same, engine RPM same, engine size the same. We're going to still see a draw through of 60 pounds. What would happen though is that the turbos would now be flowing 30 pounds a minute each in this scenario to net a mass consumption rate of 60 pounds a minute. So the two turbos flowing 30 pounds each. And now you can go up to the 120 pound minute mark because each turbo is capable of 60 pounds a minute. So how do we see this on turbo diesels? Well, it's in the form of triple turbos. A lot of you here probably seen triple turbochargers before, or at least heard of triple turbochargers before. And what triples are is two big atmospheric turbochargers. So we replace our one big turbo in compounds with two small ones. So we put two small air filters at the top. You can argue with me all day long. It is real twin turbochargers with a little helper turbo. So that's how we see real twin turbos on turbo diesels, is we see it in triples. Now the reason, and this actually, they've been doing this forever, it's becoming more popular on over-the-road applications. So our daily driven, little play toys, street trucks, towing, stuff like that. But where it's been commonplace for a very long time is in truck and tractor pulling. The reason being, in those high horsepower applications, the amount of air that those things, that they're basically getting the engine up to demanding, there is no single big atmospheric turbocharger that can supply that amount. We're talking in excess of 500 pounds a minute flow rate through these things. Actually 500 pounds. 300, 4,000, they're averaging between 3,000 to 4,000 horsepower on these unlimited classes in the truck and tractors. So if you take that divided by 8, we're looking at quite a big number. I know 4,000 is 250 pounds. 500 pounds a minute for the 4,000 horsepower stuff. 3,000 horsepower stuff. 375 pounds a minute. Even at 2,000 horsepower. Whoops. If we divide that by 8, 250 pounds a minute. Looking for turbochargers that flow, so 200 pounds a minute is about the top of where most turbos will flow. And you're getting, a 200 pound minute turbocharger, you're looking at usually a minimum. This turbo is going to run between $6,000 to $10,000. So the pricing of these ginormous turbochargers starts to get expensive. We're looking at 137, 140 plus millimeter turbochargers. These are massive turbochargers. So to get around these high costs, or the fact that the turbocharger doesn't even exist, when we get into, say, the 400 pound minute mark, 500 pound minute mark, what we do is we put two large turbochargers on, and we're going to also show you how to do two small ones. This two small turbos is what's getting to be more common practice in our smaller engine area, or more everyday people that, you might see these going around the drag strip or having fun on the pull track, or just to be cool. And they work great on top of being cool. But we look at these big ones where if you need to flow 500 pounds a minute, we can run two 130 millimeter turbochargers instead of trying to find one that doesn't exist or manufacture one that doesn't exist. In this case, what we have up on the board is a 476 SXE, and then a 62 SXE, S362 SXE. we're going to say, since the 476 tops out on the mat at 120 pounds a minute, we're going to use that marker. I'm going to use 5.9 liter engine, 359 cubic inches, 3,500 RPMs, 80% volumetric efficiency. To achieve this 8% VE above that 3,000 mark, this is probably going to be, whatever's on the manifold is going to be a gated turbocharger, more than likely. And in this case, it's also going to be, this would have to be gated if it's on the bigger turbine wheel, or the 87 turbine and a decent sized housing would be just fine. We should all see that on the dyno. So what we're going to look at the two, and what we're going to find out is basically it's more of almost a durability thing. The shaft speed of the 476 is going to get ridiculous, whereas if we were to split the workload up into two small atmospheric turbochargers, we'll have still really good spool-up characteristics without one having an expensive turbocharger. A 476 SXE with an 87 turbine is not a cheap turbocharger. Neither is the the new S362s with the 78 68 turbine. That's why I would use two T3 Atmos versus this would be a bigger T4. So we get 290.86 CFM under these conditions in it. And we know if we're going to pull 120 pounds a minute through the engine, regardless of the turbo setup, we'll take the 120 pounds a minute. It's over here. 120 pounds a minute, divide it by 0.07, or just because that's what we've been using for base for all the videos. This keeps it easy. Divide it by 0.07. That tells us how much CFM we need. 1714.28 CFM is what we need to draw through. So from there we take the 1714.28 CFM. We're going to divide that by our 290.6 CFM, which is our normally aspirated CFM. That gives us a target that we need to reach of a 5.89 density ratio. So that's what we need to get to in order to make the motor pull 120 pounds a minute. So to do this on the 476 at 3,500 RPMs, we need to basically run, we're going to keep this realistic, a 5.0 pressure ratio. So we're way up here. We're not on the map. This is where we have to kind of guess. So 5.0 pressure ratio. So 5.0, that's 58 pounds of boost. And we're going to say we've got 60% compressor efficiency on this setup. So at 5.0 pressure ratio times 0.6 gives us a density ratio of 3.0. And then we need to use the intercooler and either water methanol, a bigger or a bigger intercooler, or air to water, or some nitrate. We got to do a lot of extra cooling in this case to get ourselves from a 3.0 density ratio back up to 5.89 density ratio. If we want to kind of get a good idea what we're going to have to do, we can do the math quite a few times and find out that we're going to need, instead of a stock second-gen intercooler that would be on average 45% efficient or a 1.45 gain, we actually need to find a 2.0 gain. So we're going to have to do a lot of cooling to the air charge to get the density ratio from 3.0 back up to 5.89. If we do 2.0, it actually comes out to, let's see, 6.0. It's right in between, let's see, 1.9 and 2.0. So there's going to be an extensive amount of intercooling that has to be done to get the air charge cooled down enough to net 1714.28 CFM at a weight 0.07 pounds cubic foot to get to 120 pounds a minute drawn through the compressor into the system. So this is going to be a fairly unreliable setup, and if you've been in the industry a little bit, we do know that these tend to not last that long when pushed this hard. They will do it quite a few times, say, a season, hopefully a season, but it is not uncommon for the 72, the 76 to be pushed way beyond their mark because they are a really good turbocharger, to then have compressor hub failures where the hub splits usually into 3 sections and completely blows everything up, and it's really dangerous for everybody around. I mean, we've had it happen on the dyno before on other turbochargers, and it is a very violent thing usually that happens when a hub failure occurs, as well as it generally will shoot parts out of the compressor cover at a very high rate of speed and can injure people around. So not only is this a hard scenario to get to because of all the extra money that's going to be put into the intercooling system. To get there, it's also quite dangerous. Is it cool? Yeah. I mean, it's been done. I'm not saying it has been done. Plenty of recorded dynagraphs of it being done. Also, plenty of instances that have recorded or seen where these things have came apart. So what you can do to make the setup more reliable, because we're talking about how triples are found on, or how twin turbos are found on turbo diesels, is they're found in the form of triples. So you do is it's a compound arrangement, and what we're going to do is we're going to have two 362 SXEs for the atmospheric turbos. Instead of one turbo being atmospheric, in this case it's manifold and atmospheric, we're going to use two of them. Because the turbos are much smaller, their response rate is still good. Now it's split between two of them, so it is going to be a little bit slower if there was just one of them up there. But because they're smaller, they spin up quite a bit faster because they maintain a higher drive pressure ratio between the two stages. So in this case, we're going to use the 62 SXE. We're going to use the same 60 pounds a minute mark at 74% compressor, nets us to 74% compressor efficiency, because we're only going to be running a 3.4 pressure ratio instead of a 5.0, because we have another stage underneath that's going to multiply that. It's actually additive. It is not. You don't multiply it. But to find out what the main stage, this part on the manifold have to be doing, all we do is I take our 3.4 times 0.74. It gives us a 2.516 density ratio. We just take 5.89 minus 2.516, and that tells us that our manifold charger just needs to run a density ratio worth of work of 3.364, which is not that crazy. It's not unheard of. If we want to figure out the pressures of both, basically total pressure of the system is probably still, it's still going to be probably around this 60 to 70 psi mark, but the difference is we split the pressure stages up between two stages instead of one stage trying to do all the work. So this is a lot easier to do. We're using an exhaust gas. We're recycling exhaust gas twice. Even though the exhaust gas, after going through one turbine wheel, has less energy in it because the first stage used quite a bit of that energy, there's still plenty left over to drive the next set. So this is a lot safer. So we have two 62s feeding into whatever's on the manifold. In this case, we didn't pick what is on the manifold, don't know what's on the manifold, but this turbo is spinning at a much slower rate of speed, or a safe rate of speed, and is operating in a decent part of the map in this instance, whereas this turbocharger is way off the map. So this setup here will be able to do the 120 pounds minute mark for a very long duration. This is well within the durability region of the turbocharger, where if you tried to pull a grade and the whole way up the grade per se, you wanted that 120 pound minute mark, the turbo's probably going to explode. Where this setup here will do it all day long. Like this, 100% duty cycle. In this case, it'll do it all day long. It'll do it until you break the engine. I don't think the turbochargers have any problems in this case doing this setup that's well within a safe zone. So remember, basically there's two air filters, one air filter. So the two air filters, in this case, each air filter flows up to 75 pounds a minute. We're only going to do 60 pounds a minute, so 60 times 2, 120 pounds a minute. So that's what the capacity is. So in this, and if we wanted to max the setup out, we can pull up to 150 pounds a minute through the system with two 62s as Atmos, where in this case we can only pull up to 120 pounds a minute map-wise. There's more that can be had out here. Again, it's a danger zone. They usually only operate in those zones in competition, so people are far away. When things do explode, nobody gets hurt.
How about like sizing all three though? So if you have two 362s, how do you choose your manifold?
We could do a separate video for that. But how I would size the manifold turbo is, I'd size the manifold turbo based on how quickly I wanted the system to come online and how far in the RPM band I wanted the system to operate. So in this case, this operating at 3,500 RPMs, if I didn't want to run an external wastegate on the system I would probably actually have something like a 467, a 472, or a 476 T4 with an 87 turbine on the manifold, just because we're going to need a good amount of exhaust flow to maintain good engine volumetric efficiency, operating up at the higher RPM mark here. If we were going to run an external gate that would allow us to run a smaller manifold charger, I would probably do something in either like a 366 or T3 setup, plus a big external gate, or a T4 with a medium-sized external gate to make that work. The big thing is we want to make sure that drive pressure is in check at the engine RPM mark we want to run it. So obviously, the smaller the manifold turbocharger, the faster the two 62s are going to come on. Because we split the 62s up, the same thing that we were talking about in twins, where now it takes twice the amount of energy to get them going, is still true. So the faster the manifold turbo comes online, that's why we use a manifold turbocharger in diesel applications, because we need the exhaust energy density basically to come up as quick as possible to turn the twins on. So the smaller the manifold turbocharger, the faster we run up the density ratio graph. So the faster the motor starts to think it's bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, the faster these come online. The caveat, I guess that's a fancy word. The caveat is that the smaller you make the manifold turbocharger, the lower your volumetric efficiency is going to be at, like, say, a given RPM. That's not always the case. So in this case, it would be true. But if we were operating at below 3,000 RPMs, then it would be just fine. But if you want, the torque peaks they're just sharper the smaller the manifold turbocharger housing gets, because it gets in the choke flow sooner, and it rises in drive pressure over time past the choke point faster. So the engine VE falls at a faster rate after you hit the peak, that smaller that housing is. So the way you can get around that is with the external gate, is once you hit the pressure cutoff and mass flow rate cutoff of the housing, you would just gate the rest around it. And by doing that, you can open up some RPM use with those smaller housings while still getting the benefits of a faster spooling system now, because there's multiple units. As long as the torque output isn't to the point where you have head gasket issues, bending rods, splitting blocks. It's something you gotta be careful with. Hurting torque converters, breaking input shafts, slipping clutches. I mean, those are all things to consider. What is your rest of your drivetrain and block capable of handling before making something that does come on too fast, because you can produce way more torque than the engine itself was designed to hold, or your drivetrain. And that'll, on top of the triples costing a bunch of money, that'll cost a lot of money. But small triples for over-the-road stuff is definitely more expensive than the compound setup. The response rates, though, of the triples does tend to be, when done right, can be a little bit better. You can use like two really fast spooling twins for the Atmos that are smaller. It tends to cost more, because when you're in these small frame and mid frame, this is a medium-sized turbo. This isn't big. There's a lot bigger than this thing out there. This is a medium-sized turbocharger. The cost versus size, they're all about the same. So when you're in the small turbos, you're kind of buying one extra turbocharger, and you got a lot of extra plumbing and fab work to do, but they look really cool. They sound really good. Their response rate tends to be pretty good. If we were to compare response rates, in this case, they'd be about the same. If you did a T4 87 110 or something larger than that for the Atmo, then the response rates would be about the same. But if you ran this setup with a T6, but also if you're going to run a T6 housing for the atmospheric, then you're going to want to bump this up too. You do want your choke flow points of the two turbine housings to be kind of within each other's area. That's always a good thing. One thing that we see done a lot is we put a really big housing on the Atmo and then a really small housing on the Manifold. And what that does is essentially your peak torque location is almost always going to be chosen by the manifold turbocharger. So wherever this thing goes into peak torque, I should say the curve stays about the same shape. So even though the peak torque of a big turbocharger setup is 5,000 RPMs, we're still going to see peak torque at 2,500 RPMs, even in the compound arrangement. There are some cover-ups for that. We can go over that stuff in a different video, probably, because it's a little bit in-depth as to what can make those kind of changes. As to what moves peak torque around in the system in compounds, there's a couple ways you can you can move around, and two, you can cover it up with other things. You can cover it up with density ratio versus the rate that the volumetric efficiency is dropping versus the rate the density ratio is going up if the system is still building pressure. Things that can happen that make it look like the peak torque moved because of a atmospheric turbine side change, when in reality it was probably the compressor efficiencies in total put together plus intercooling that was outweighing the loss in engine VE. Anything else? Did I explain the one question decently? Yeah, that's like the big thing. Either they don't manufacture the turbocharger, in the case of like truck and tractor pulling, they don't make a single unit that flows 500 pounds a minute, so we have to pair together multiple 125, 250, 200, 250 pound minute systems as Atmos to net a mass flow of the 500. And then to keep the engine RPM realistic, we put one to spool the two ginormous things, and two, to keep the engine RPMs realistic, we put a manifold unit in that's also quite large in these high flow cases to light the two Atmos up, as well as get us the density ratio we want through two compression stages. So like if you're in a truck and tractor pulling, you'll still see triple HX82s that are modified. They're not OEM, they're aftermarket, and they'll be in excess of 100 millimeters. Some of these things can be taken out to about 143 millimeters. Thing is about as big as they go currently. And they'll run two 143s with like a 98 to 115 on the manifold on these setups. The big super farm, same thing. Some of them will have triples. They'll have 4 turbochargers, 3 turbos to draw in from the single stage, and super semis. They can have up to they can, by the books, have up to 4 stages of compression in those to net over 300 to 400 pounds of boost. Some of those systems, it's pretty extreme. Alright, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you can get notified of the next one. Not sure what we want to do on the next one. We can either go over understanding compound turbos, or maybe go over understanding fuel types. Probably we'll keep doing turbos for the turbo series, but we can also do understanding how fuel works and the combustion cycle in the diesel engine, how it's very dynamic. It's not a static cycle. It's not always the same every single time the combustion event occurs. A lot of stuff happens in a very short amount of time that the engine cares about, and is often overlooked. We can go over a lot of those things. You can let us know in the comments maybe what you want to hear. You want to hear about how to actually understand compound turbochargers, how to like lay out and do all the math for them, or do you want to go over fuel types next to understand methanol, diesel fuel, nitromethane, stuff like that. What the additives do, what's the chemistry of the fuel, what happens in the chamber during the injection vent, what happens inside the injection pump, how is the fuel put into the chamber, transferred from injection pump to cylinder, or from rail to cylinder, all that fun stuff. We can go over whatever you want. So, thank you very much, and hope you have a good night. I'm not really big enough to make this I'm not big enough to make this kind of work as good as I want.
Yeah, it's pretty faint.
Well, I'm just saying turbo-wise, like it'd be nice if I had like a GT55 or something like that.
Oh, not a bigger piece of paper, just a bigger turbo.
Yeah.
Oh. A bigger piece of paper would be nice as well.
That's all I ordered. Is it recording?
Yeah, we're already a minute and a half in.
Can you explain this to me?
That's your job.
Oh, crap.
The end.